Hello, hello, wherever you are. Good morning or good afternoon or good evening, as the case may be. Welcome to the LSE public lecture series online, of course, these times around. My name is Piroska Mohacsi. I am an economist. I work as the program director of the Institute of Global Affairs at the LSE School of Public Policy. The subject of today's event is something that we all itching to learn about, is fiscal policies to support people and growth for recovery. This is part of our now long-standing COVID series at the LSE that we have launched back in March, really a very different world and universe. And now here we are after many events and a very exciting one, which we host together with the LSE School of Public Policy, the LSE's Financial Markets Group, in collaboration with the International Monetary Fund and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Indeed, today, again, this is about fiscal policy for crisis management, but I think we also want to hear about recovery. We want to focus on recovery and the role of fiscal policy in this, because partly because we are all really honestly fed up with the pandemic and with all the hardship that imposes on people, societies, economies. And we really want to look beyond. But it's partly because the lockdown is following some good news, encouraging news recently. The lockdown is now being eased to various degrees, various extents, obviously a lot of country variations, but it's being eased up, and then we can be a little bit more optimistic, perhaps looking beyond. We are not thinking, I think, collectively that the crisis is gone and the virus is gone. It's not, but we will have to live with that, with the situation, and manage the risk and the virus, pandemic-related risk. And there, at the center of this, is very much government policy. It's interesting to note, just a quick thought, that this time around, unlike in the global financial crisis just a decade ago, really fiscal policy is the only game in town. It used to be the central bank during the global financial crisis. Now this is fiscal policy. Central banks have played a very important supportive role, but the conductor, so to speak, is really of all the action is government. And in a very broad sense, fiscal policy by the government itself at various levels, but also what the IMF actually in his recent fiscal monitor has called it the other government, state-owned enterprises and development banks. We are not going to speak about the quasi-fiscal operation of central banks. That will be actually a subject of a forthcoming other webinar. We have a truly terrific panel to discuss all this, bringing expertise and knowledge from both academia and international organizations. We have two IFRs represented, the IMF and the EBRD, and of course our very own LSE academia. Let me introduce the panel members. From the IMF, we have Catherine Pattillo, who is Assistant Director in the Fiscal Affairs Department and the Chief of the Fiscal Policy and Surveillance Division. Catherine has built up a vast policy experience at the IMF and also has, as many of you, has a strong research record. Then we will have two senior economists also working in the Fiscal Affairs Department, Raphael Lam and Mehdi Raissi. Their presentation will be kicking off today's panel. They are co-authors of the Fiscal Monitor, on which part of the panel draws. From the LSE, we welcome Simeon Djankov, who is co-director of the LSE's prestigious Financial Markets Group. But to many of you, Simeon was most known perhaps as an outstanding Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance of Bulgaria in an equally difficult time, I would say, in 2009 and 2013, and has helped his country, but also the region to get to the path of recovery then. So he brings to the panel a rare combination of top-notch academic and policy expertise. And last not least, we will hear from the EBRD, represented by Zsoka Koczan, Zsoka is now a senior economist at the EBRD's Office of the Chief Economist. She actually also had worked for the IMF previously. So we have a fantastic panel. And before we start, I am obligated to give our kind audience some housekeeping matters. As you many returning viewers know, the hashtag for this series is hashtag LSE COVID-19. Quite self-explanatory. This online event is being recorded and hopefully will be made available as a podcast on the LSE podcast series, subject to no technical difficulties. And a few things about the Zoom facilities that we are using. I know that most of you are familiar, you are returning audience and very familiar with the Zoom facilities. As usual, there will be a chance for you to put up your questions to our panelists. And we really encourage you to do so. We want an engaged audience. You can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. You can address your questions specifically to a panel member or raise the question in the general form, and then I will allocate it. The questions will be submitted to me, and I will pose them and then direct them to the person, to the speaker. Please let us know your affiliation and name. And we are very keen, of course, to hear from our students, alumni, and incoming students to the LSE. So please just let us know. Finally, as you know, probably we also live stream this event on Facebook, and you can pose questions also through that channel. And we will try to bring in as many as possible. But enough of the housekeeping and the introduction, so let's get started. I am turning to the IMF team leader, Catherine, the word for a few words of introduction on your side. Catherine?
Thank you, Piroska. Thanks for this excellent introduction. We're very happy to be here. As you mentioned, the presentations and discussion that we'll have today are based on our April 2020 Fiscal Monitor, which has taken on even more importance, as you note, in this time of the COVID pandemic. And what we did in the Fiscal Monitor was, first, we looked at how governments then can save lives and protect livelihoods during the pandemic. And the message was simple: do whatever it takes, but make sure to keep the receipts. Secondly, then we started to look forward and to look at how governments then can help in supporting the recovery as the lockdowns ease. And here we proposed a framework that we called IDEAS, which is about thinking about how investment can be brought forward, how governments can use smart discretionary policies, tax and spending, and how they can enhance their automatic stabilizers, particularly social safety nets, and how these kinds of policies then could help as we come out of the lockdowns. And third, then the Fiscal Monitor looked at state-owned enterprises, the other government, which is an important topic at any time. And we looked then at how governments could get the most out of state-owned enterprises, how taxpayers can make sure that we get value for money from state-owned enterprises. But they're, of course, even more important now during this time of the pandemic, as the government's role in the economy has intensified. So we're very much looking forward to the discussion, the questions, the interaction with the audience today. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Catherine, for getting us into the panel mood. And I turn to Raphael Lam. Raphael, the floor, the virtual is yours.
Okay, thank you. Let me share my screen on some of the slides so that everyone and the participant can take a look at some of the materials that we prepared at the Fiscal Monitor. So as Catherine mentioned, this is a summary of the Fiscal Monitor. So basically, she has already outlined some of the roadmap or the overview of our presentation today. We'll start looking at some of the global trends pre-COVID-19 and the global economy, and then we will look at some of the fiscal policies and the strategies in how to handle during the pandemics, as well as after the pandemic started to phase out. We also need to think about what is the policies going forward after the greater lockdown. So in terms of the global trends, so certainly one particular issues that is very particular at this period is that there's a low interest rate. So the debt insurance costs are currently at a very low level historically. So if you take a look at this chart, which shows the 10-year government bond yields, the low rates are unprecedented over the last 115 years. And many governments, including in the advanced economies, are borrowing at a negative interest rate, with over 1/5 of the global bonds are now trading at a negative yields now. The second global trend is about high public and private debt. Here shows the public debt is high and rising. The weighted average debt to GDP ratios across all income groups, advanced economies, emerging markets, as well as no income developing countries are all rising rapidly, partly because of the pandemic impact and the associated fiscal response. But at the same time, even at the low interest rate, you could see that the interest debt service burden as a share of the tax revenue, that the solid black lines across income groups are also rising over time. So as a result, the public debt remains a key source of vulnerabilities in many countries, and which is likely to constrain some of the scope of fiscal policy in response to the pandemic. The third global trend is a very subdued or sluggish growth environment with no inflation. So global growth was already at a very subdued level, at about 3% of growth in 2019. And now with many countries experiencing a sharp contraction during the pandemic. This period of slow growth is particularly concerning because a lot of the emerging markets, as well as advanced countries, will need high growth to quell some of the rising domestic social and political tensions. Inflation rates have also been very modest and anchored at the very low levels below the central bank's target. So in terms of the fiscal policy's response to support people during the COVID-19 pandemics, we look into some of the country measures and document what happened globally. So many governments have put forward swift and significant emergency lifelines to protect people in response to the pandemic, including, for example, cash transfers, government paid sick leaves, and some of the temporary tax cuts. So at the fund, at the IMF, we have been trying to keep track of the fiscal measures across countries since the outbreak. So the total size of the fiscal support is about 9 trillion as of mid-May, and it's likely to increase as countries continue to roll out some packages since then. At a speed amount, roughly speaking, about half is on direct budget support through revenue and spending measures. And the other half is on the liquidity support, which you see on the right-hand side chart on loans, equities, and guarantees. So G20 economies account for the bulk of the global fiscal support, about 90%. So on the left chart, you could see that the COVID-19 fiscal response have been much stronger than those during the global financial crisis. Another observation is that the government is to provide sizable liquidity support through the public sector loans and guarantees. For example, the liquidity support is more than 15% of GDP each in Germany, Italy, and United Kingdom. So this is very sizable. And at the fund, we will continue to update some of the numbers. And in the fiscal monitor, we also track the country-specific fiscal measures. So in light of all these measures, certainly one of the adverse impact is on the public finances, which includes, as you could see in the chart, there's a significant surge of government debt, as well as a deterioration in terms of the fiscal balances. And those changes as significant more so than during the global financial crisis. So overall, the fiscal deficit are expected to widen by about 12% and more, and the global debt is estimated to rise more significantly. So in terms of the types of the fiscal measures, so certainly, as I mentioned, some governments roll out the revenues measures and provide additional spending, while other governments provide liquidity support. So this is important to keep track because various measures have different implications on public finances. Some, like additional spending and tax deferral, may affect the budget balances and have debt implications. However, others, such as government provision of guarantees, may not change the budget balances or debt today, but it will have some implications down the road on debt, particularly if those guarantees are called and the government incurred losses. So there are sizable of contingent liabilities that would pose fiscal risk down the road. And at the same time, some of the liquidity support is not provided directly by the government, but through state-owned banks or enterprises. And that's why it is important to also look into the other side of the government as we keep track of the fiscal policies in response to the pandemic. The IMF has, in the latest Fiscal Monitor, in the April version, we also include a chapter on the state-owned banks and enterprises, which is also relevant in the context of the pandemic, given some of the fiscal responses undertaken through those entities. So state-owned enterprises or SOEs are among the world's largest firms. Many have multinational status and have operations across the borders. So for instance, in this chart, you could see that, let's say Europe has a lot of SOEs that have cross-border operations, about 600 of them. And they are particularly present in key sectors such as oil and energy sector, as well as financial sector. So in terms of the policy mandates, they certainly face some challenges. Most of them are well understood. Here, I want to highlight the issue of underfunded mandates because this is some of the relatively less focused, but an important angle. This is especially critical when SOEs are not allowed to charge full prices to cover all their costs, such as maintaining some of the infrastructure. In some cases, the gap between the costs and prices is very large, putting at risk the ability of the SOEs to operate in a sustainable manner. The weak performance of SOEs could also lead to significant fiscal risk, including because SOE may borrow excessively, just as this chart has shown. So that sometimes is higher than the government debt by SOEs. The support to non-financial SOEs in some countries are very sizable, as much as 10% of GDP. So important questions for the policy angle will be how to get most out of the SOEs given their existing mandates and existing challenges. Here, we advise the governments or the policymakers could use public resources appropriately on those SOEs. For instance, periodically review some of the rationales for SOEs, such as those rationales provided in Germany or Netherlands. Close or privatize some of the SOEs when markets are competitive, when it will make some of the firms become more efficient down the road. The policies on the SOEs has also need to be consistent with the macro fiscal policies, such as some of the broad policy perspectives would be fitting into the public sector angle, so that some of the works, such as in New Zealand, they can be put under the broad public sector perspective to consider what is the role of the SOEs. Fiscal targets will also be important to consider so as to make use of the SOEs to generate reasonable returns, even though making profits may not be the key priorities of the SOEs. Getting the incentives right is important. This will include the pricing policies and regulations. In the fund, we also discusses the importance of strengthening the institutions, including transparency, oversight of SOEs, and the disclosures of all the financials between the SOEs as well as the general government. Here on the right chart, you could see that we have done some empirical work using the lawful database from the IMF programs to study the impact of the reforms. This chart reflects the results across sectors, including mining, utilities, as well as different sectors. So let's look at the transport sector, the third category from the left. The chart shows that the percent of productivity improvement when considering different types of reforms. For instance, the green for governance reform, the blue for the pricing reform. And for all reforms, it is labeled in red. So all three bars in the transport sectors are solid, meaning that the indicated improvement in the productivity was significant at 1% level. And for governance and pricing reform, it could improve about 14 to 15% of productivity gains. The improvement in all reforms is slightly less, partly because other aspects of reform, such as arrears adherence of the SOEs, may not have direct impact on the productivity, although they would improve the liquidity of SOEs as well as provide and create a better situations for the private sector as a whole. So maybe I will stop here, and then my colleague Mehdi will go through some of the fiscal policies after the great lockdown. Thank you.
Excellent. Mehdi, we turn to you now. Just please be mindful of the time. We want to leave also time for questions. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. So I'd like to talk about fiscal policies for after the great lockdown, or this is going to be a gradual transition. So in the meantime also. Raphael mentioned some of the trends, the global trends. And when we look at the literature to understand the underlying explanations for these global trends, two strands of literature come to mind. One is the prolonged stagnation literature, and the other one is debt supercycle. And debt supercycle is the persistent increase in leverage throughout the economy, different sectors. So on the prolonged stagnation part, on the demand side, reasons include aging populations, globalization and the desire for safe assets, and income inequality, rising income inequality, which is an important area. And also on the supply side, the literature talks about slowing productivity growth, a very weak capital accumulation, especially in advanced countries, but also in emerging markets since 2013, and shrinking labor force in advanced and large EMs. So these are some of the reasons why growth has been weak, and some of the other trends that we have observed. And also on the debt side, you can think about the financial boom that preceded the Great Recession. It came to a halt, an abrupt halt, and then left many countries with balance sheet vulnerabilities. And also you can think about continued credit expansion in China. So given these explanations, what is the role of fiscal policy? What can it do to help increase growth in a sustained manner? Here we think we present a framework for responding to this weaker growth. We call it ideas, as Kathy mentioned at the very beginning. The first layer is investing for the future, and especially in a very low interest rate environment. But the key question is, how can policymakers make the most out of public investment given high public debt levels? When we look at the literature, we observe that investment needs are massive. We are talking about 1.3% of GDP per year, or on a cumulative basis, $20 trillion over the next 2 decades. This consists of about 0.5% of GDP per year of investment to cover infrastructure gaps, mostly on transportation. This also covers the need for meeting SDG goals of different countries. That's another 0.2% of GDP per year. And also, very importantly, to mitigate climate change, we need an additional 0.6% of GDP in low carbon investment in the energy sector. So most of these needs are concentrated in emerging markets and developing economies. Let's see what we can, if governments were to accommodate these investment needs, what would be the macro impacts of them? We rely on a couple of in-house models to analyze the impact on growth, inflation, real interest rates, and also public debt of meeting these global investment needs. We assume a persistent public investment by the government, 1.3% of GDP initially, and then it gradually declines after 20 years. It reaches 0.6% of GDP. The cumulative size of the injection is 18% of GDP. We simulate the macro effects of this public investment push, and also discuss a very important issue, the role of investment inefficiencies, which they lower the extent of public capital accumulation. Think about time delays in projects, cost overruns, governance problems, etc. As a result of these, globally, when we look across countries, we see that about 16 to 44% of public investment goes into waste. So what can governments do about that? Assuming that investment is efficient, public investment, and the chart, you can see that public investment could give a boost to output by about 1.5% per year on average over 2 decades. So think about 30% increase in the level of GDP by the end of the projection horizon. It generates about 60 basis points inflation on average after 2 years, which dissipates over time as the supply potential of the economy expands. And the impact on public debt is rather modest. However, if these strong macro effects in the baseline would be much weaker if supply side rigidities by that, which could lead to lower investment efficiency. They constrain capital accumulation. So relative to the baseline in the charts, we get only 1/3 of the boost to GDP. We get higher inflation over time, and then we get significant debt increases. So this is an area which is of very, very much importance. The second pillar of the IDEAS approach is preparing discretionary measures. And here, when we look at the discretionary measures in the past, just abstracting from the response to COVID-19 for a second, we see that discretionary responses usually came too little, too late, and were not at times targeted. So we know that in the context of COVID, as Raphael mentioned, governments have already provided significant emergency lifelines to people and firms, and it was timely. But thinking about the recovery phase, the first and most important thing is to rehire workers after the pandemic abates. So governments in this respect can plan temporary payroll tax cuts to encourage firms to hire workers. To get people to spend, governments can use time-bound value-added tax reductions or consumption vouchers. Smaller investment projects can also be accelerated, and more broadly, to deal with future pandemics, to deal with future shocks, countries can legislate in advance measures that would be automatically activated in downturns. Think about a form of rules-based fiscal activism. And the third pillar here is enhancing automatic stabilizers. Automatic stabilizers think about progressive income taxes, unemployment benefits, social safety net programs. These are sizable and these are timely because they coincided well with previous recessions. We have experienced that today. Can we enhance them permanently? This is the question that we would like to ask. And the answer is yes. And most importantly, the unemployment benefits system and social safety net programs. If you look at the chart here, you can see that a significant portion of the loss in aggregate consumption after an unemployment shock or income shock is restored by countries' tax benefit systems. For example, consider the case of Denmark. If aggregate consumption falls by 1%, the tax benefit system in Denmark restores over 1/3 of the loss, while that of Italy restores only 10% of the loss. So there's room for improvement, especially the social safety net. What are the good attributes of a good social safety net? Here we can think about the safety net providing broad coverage and adequate benefits in a progressive way so that the poor get more of the benefits. Preserve work incentives and help beneficiaries find jobs, obtain healthcare, attend education and training. And try to be simple, avoiding a fragmented, complex web of social assistance programs that end up being very costly to run and not benefiting people in a fair way. This should be avoided. Finally, against these yardsticks, social safety nets in many countries can be improved. In emerging markets and developing countries, there are significant gaps in terms of coverage and coverage of the low-income groups and also the benefit levels, the generosity. On average, they cover less than 1/5 of the poorest quintile of households. And the average transfer amount is 13% of the consumption of bottom 20%. For advanced countries, the problems are of a different nature. They have better developed safety nets, so concerns relate to improving the outcomes of existing programs, expanding coverage based on enhanced means testing and better preserving work incentives. Here, a guaranteed minimum income or a two-pillar unemployment benefit system would be beneficial. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mehdi. That was a beautiful complement to the previous presentation and looking forward. So I'm turning now to Simeon from LSE academics, but also a lead politician in a similarly challenging era. Simeon, the future floor is yours.
Thank you, Piroska. Indeed, the last crisis, the Eurozone crisis, was similar in magnitude in some countries. There was some uncertainty, but not anywhere near the uncertainty that we're facing now as to the length of this current crisis. So I'd like to make 3 points. The first one indeed is on the uncertainties that we face. It is indeed a positive sign that a number of the countries that had difficulties early on with the pandemic are now coming out of lockdowns, instituting some still safe social distancing measures, but you can see life returning to maybe not to normal, but to some semblance of normality. But we should say, however, that in this normality, there are at least 2 large uncertainties as regards money that we as governments will have to spend in the future. One of it is cross-sectoral. So we know that some sectors are not going to recover quickly, even if the rest of the economy recovers, even if the pandemic is hopefully behind us soon. There is studies, there are a number of previous episodes that we can draw on that say it's probably right that the tourist sector for some time in the future is not going to be the same as it was before. People are going to travel less, so transport is going to be different. We know also from the latest data, but also from previous crises, that the uncertainty of incomes makes people consume bulky, large products less. So we've seen this in numbers on furniture, for example, numbers on car manufacturing and sales and so on. So a number of sectors will need not just continued, but new forms of government assistance. And this is really across the world, because just as we worry about tourism in beautiful Croatia, we also worry about tourism in a number of developing countries, and actually some small countries depend a lot on tourist receipts, for example. So the uncertainty will bring us new instruments, I predict, not just more of the same amounts of money that we're spending, but new ways to finance sectors, which really we have not yet done, with the exception of some very large businesses like in the airline industry and so on. We have not seen countries do sectoral support yet. And I predict we will be seeing this in the future, and it will differ across countries depending on what their main sectors are. The second point to make is that some of the forms of assistance where large fiscal resources have been spent, payroll support was mentioned, various furlough schemes, the Kurzarbeit, that Germany established in the previous crisis and now is used quite a lot around the world, has been tremendous, and some countries are continuing it for some time. But you quickly, as the economy opens or reopens in some sectors, you face a different issue, which is we have supported firms for the last 3-4 months, primarily through supporting jobs, job retention, which was the right policy then. But what if the firm opens and finds out that because of this uncertain demand or because of how their financial situation was even pre-crisis, they actually cannot survive? And my prediction is that in a number of countries, advanced as well as developing economies, there are going to be many, many firms that were anyhow on the brink probably of survival, and now they were pushed beyond this brink. This brings different instruments and different government policies, or should bring, because we no longer can depend, for example, on payroll support, since even if you give 100% wage support to the business itself, is just not viable. So how to make as many business to survive this next recovery phase is a topic that a number of us have thought about, but clearly some additional and perhaps different types of fiscal resources will need to go into this recovery phase on the survival of companies, not just jobs, but the survival of companies. And my last point, Piroska, is again, medium and long term, is that as we think of the survival of companies and the fact that some are not going to survive, and as we also think about the uncertainty of personal incomes because of the jobs that we just discussed and the uncertainty around that, you also need to start thinking about what the next tax system is going to be. Because in this crisis, and the speakers also mentioned that we would temporarily like to defer corporate income taxes, we would temporarily like to provide payroll support with grants and so on, but this costs money. And we've already spent a lot of money. The IMF team showed very nice graphs on this. We're going to continue spending money on this, but eventually the tax system needs to adjust. We cannot just keep piling debts. Some countries are starting to think about this, and I'll finish with this thought, and it is the general direction actually that Europe has taken after the last crisis, can be a lesson for everybody else, is that you essentially have a shift from direct taxes, corporate income tax, personal income tax, to indirect taxes, VAT, excise taxes, environmental taxes in developing countries that depend a lot on natural resources, oil-related taxes, that depend less on this issue that I mentioned, uncertainty of personal incomes and survival of firms. I think this is a direction that we will see in the near future, not immediately, but in the next few months, because we do have to spend a lot, as Catherine started by saying, and governments have done that, but we also need to think about the stability of public finances in the year to come. And I think this discussion is coming with your panel. Piroska, thank you.
Thank you very much, Simeon. The questions are coming in, and quite a few of those actually touch upon the points that you have just raised. So I will be turning them to you in due course. But before doing that, going to the questions, we will have still one excellent speaker, Zsoka Koczan from the EBRD. Zsoka, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me share my screen as well. I would like to talk about fiscal policy in the context of individuals' willingness to take risks, or if you look at it in reverse, the demand for socializing risks. And this is based on joint work with Philip Petzold and Alexander Plekanov, also at the EBRD. So in recent years, we've seen a trend with risk being increasingly shifted onto individuals. So if you think of the gig economy, zero-hour contracts, decline in state pensions, and often these risks were shifted onto individuals who dislike them the most. Now, we expect that the economic effects of the current crisis will disproportionately impact low-income groups. They are less likely to have permanent contracts. They are more likely to work for small and medium-sized enterprises and vulnerable sectors such as retail or tourism. They are more likely to be self-employed or to work in the informal economy in emerging markets and developing economies. So overall, they're more likely to face job losses, and they're also often more difficult for governments to support and find with targeted measures. Low-income groups also dislike risk more, whichever way the causality may run. So in the chart on the left, you can see that risk tolerance generally increases with income. But this pattern is even more pronounced if we zoom in on people who say that they are unwilling to take any risks. So if you look at the blue bars here, you can see that in the countries where the EBRD operates, these are mostly middle-income countries in Europe, Central Asia, and the Southern and Eastern Mediterranean, about 30% of respondents in the bottom income decile said that they are unwilling to take risks at all. Now, risk, of course, very much come to the forefront of the current crisis, but even more generally, we see that people who are risk averse are more likely to be employed in the public sector, including in state-owned enterprises. This chart shows you for each level of risk tolerance, from those not willing to take risks at all on the left of the chart to those who say they're very willing to take risks, whether they are more likely to work in the public sector or in a state-owned enterprise than the average in the country in which they live. And you can see that the left of the chart, that those who are more risk averse, who are less willing to take risks, are more likely to work in the public sector or in a state-owned enterprise. And this holds up even when controlling for individual characteristics. We see a very similar pattern if we look at country level data instead of at the individuals. Here again, we see that higher levels of risk aversion correlate with higher shares of public sector employment, higher shares of employment in state-owned enterprises as well. So you can see countries towards the top right of the scatter will have higher shares of the population that say they are unwilling to take any risks, but also higher shares of public sector employment. Now, as of course, risks become very prominent in the context of the current crisis, and we see increasing demand for socializing risks. This raises the question, this raises demand for the state to step in, either directly as an employer, but also more broadly as insurance, as investment. And this raises questions about countries' ability to afford this higher level of state involvement that is demanded. But it also raises a question whether states have the administrative capacity in very practical terms to deliver the sort of targeted support that is expected. Looking first at ability to afford this, as we already heard from Raphael, interest rates are at historically low levels. And indeed, for many countries, fiscal constraints may be, at least for now, less binding than they were in previous crises, although circumstances, of course, vary widely. So here you can see a bunch of countries clustered below the 45-degree line. suggests that this country than it has years. However, for many countries, administrative constraints may actually be more binding than fiscal constraints. And this scatter is very much inspired by a very nice chart from the Fiscal Monitor, which tried to outline countries' policy options depending on the amount of fiscal space they have available, but also depending on the level of administrative capacity in the country to provide targeted support. We tried to operationalize this by constructing an index of fiscal space and an index of administrative capacity to try to plot where countries stand in terms of policy options available to them. So for the index of fiscal space, we take into account how much debt the country already has, government revenues, government balance, and existing interest payments. Well, for administrative capacity, we look at a measure of e-government, but also the World Bank doing business indicators, the worldwide governance indicators of regulatory quality and government effectiveness. The dots in blue to the right of this chart are advanced economies, where you can see that they tend to have fairly high levels of administrative capacity, but there's quite a bit of variation in how much fiscal space is available to these countries. If you turn to the other side of the chart, you can see the green dots. These would be low-income countries. It's typically lower levels of administrative capacity. So these here for these countries, as well as for some middle-income economies, administrative capacity constraints may be more binding and definitely more so in the short term. Now, fiscal constraints and administrative capacity have shaped policy responses. And in the next chart, we look at some of the early policy measures that have been adopted by the countries where the EBRD operates. So again, mostly middle-income countries in Europe, Central Asia, and the Southern and Eastern Mediterranean. Here we plot the share of countries that have implemented various measures. You already heard about some of these, such as payment holidays on loans, which were very common, as you can see in the yellow bar here to the right. We've seen that a lot of countries allowed for taxes or social security contributions to be deferred. Some countries with higher levels of administrative capacity, for instance, in Central Europe or in Southeastern Europe, introduced wage subsidies, often conditional on maintaining employment, or introduced measures that were specifically targeting vulnerable groups, such as the self-employed. However, we noticed that in a number of countries where EBRD operates, we also saw different, perhaps less specifically targeted measures, such as increasing support for pensioners, who may be less affected by the economic impact of the pandemic. However, this was a pre-existing channel, which was easier for governments to rely on to provide stimulus. We've also seen some second best measures, for instance, temporary controls on prices, controlling the prices of basic goods. These were introduced in a number of economies with more limited administrative capacity, for instance, in Central Asia, the Caucasus, or some of the poorer economies of the Western Balkans. Now, these price controls, while distortionary, were a means of maintaining the purchasing power of lower income households in a context where administrative capacity may not be there to quickly provide support that is targeted specifically at those most vulnerable to the effects of the crisis. So for countries where administrative capacity tends to be the binding constraint, there could be scope for building crisis response tools for the future. For instance, setting up a centralized payment registry that would allow for better targeting of support once the next crisis hits. And then if I can just end on a more general note and a little bit of advertising, for fiscal stimulus to be effective would need to be accompanied by increasing private sector confidence. Now, of course, this is especially important for investment, which is most sensitive to uncertainty. So here there's the scope for governments to step in not just as employers and as providing insurance, but also as investments. This could be an opportunity to invest more in green investments. They defined this could be an opportunity for tilting to green. And this is something that our upcoming transition report that will come out in November will say a lot more about, alongside the changing role of the state in the context of the current crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Zsoka, and all the panel speakers. Without further ado, let's now get down to the questions. We have quite a few flowing in reaction also to what you're saying, and in general, very good questions. Let me start out with Maximilian Munrose. He's a student from Scotland, and he is asking a very pertinent questions. You have a huge fiscal stimulus, a lot of plans for big public sector investment. Normally, these come with inefficiency risks, risk of wasting resources, and I would add also corruption risks. So the question is, what if you were to single out a couple of few factors which would ensure to minimize these risks of inefficiency, waste, and I'm adding corruption in the context of these huge stimulus packages and the investment projects? Who would like? Catherine and Simeon, I thought maybe both of you, if you could address these questions.
Yeah, thanks, Piroska. So I'll start. So we have lots of work that we've been doing with countries on how to improve their overall public investment management processes. And I think that's really the key starting point, because we've talked about how it's important to start to prepare investment projects early, which would mean starting to get in projects that could be implemented soon. But you don't want to just pick on projects without the overall management of the process to make sure that you're getting good projects. So that's the whole institutional setup of ensuring projects are well selected, that they're well monitored, that they're evaluated, that you have good relations coordination between various levels of government, that you ensure that public procurement is done well, so that you minimize those corruption risks. I'd start there.
Thank you. Simeon?
Yeah, so Piroska, unlike the previous crisis and maybe the previous 2 or 3 crises, where a way out in terms of fiscal support was to help with large public projects, so infrastructure projects and so on, I think this crisis is somewhat different in that a lot of the support is going to hundreds of thousands and sometimes millions of firms. And we've seen this for the payroll support that we've mentioned, job retention schemes, where they are going to individuals. There, the risk of corruption is very small or non-existent. You can over time then argue, who are we supporting, which sectors and which firms? So that was my first point earlier. And I think we're getting very quickly to that point. So we'll be spending a large public resources. Some industries that are used to this type of support, airline industry, for example, comes very quickly first and says, we want money, and they get money, or large car companies and so on. And I think one very legitimate question is that I see a few people in the question queue have asked, are we supporting old industries, or should we actually think of new industries? Because as we know from Schumpeter and so on, the idea of creative destruction is that this is also an opportunity to see which sectors are actually efficient and which are not, and which firms are efficient and which firms are not. That was not possible so far. So far, we needed to support every worker and every company. But in the future, neither can we support that financially, because no government is so rich, no, I think it is the efficient way to go. And which is why we very, very soon, in the next weeks, literally, we need to think which sectors are the sectors of the future and we should be supporting, and which sectors we should basically let try on their own. And if they don't survive, we're reasonably sure, because they're competitive, that new firms, new ideas will come into that. Because no matter how rich some countries are, they're not going to be able to support everybody in this next recovery period. So I think it's not so much about corruption and inefficiency, it's this question of We went through the initial period. Some countries are still going through this initial period. As recovery starts, where do we focus and with what instruments? And I think once we select the right instruments, inefficiency and corruption will kind of be limited that way.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a very hopeful take on this. I have heard some country examples without naming names, where the procurement process was in the name of, for the sake of time, allegedly, has been circumvented. And then, of course, the perception is that there might be ulterior motives behind it. But let's hope, as you say, that this will be less of a case this time around. Let me stay with you, Simeon, because you picked up one of the questions, and I think you answered it. But many economists, and this is coming actually from a former LSE PhD student of ours, Tabi Leoka from Johannesburg, and the question is: state-owned enterprises often are ailing anyways. Often they are in state hands because they are, for one reason or another, they do not really organize along profit motives. So is there some kind of a guidance as to which state-owned enterprise to help, and whether there is an ailing state-owned enterprise but actually it performs some additional goals which would require support, and in what sector? There is a question, should we support agriculture, for example, given the food security that comes up as a self-insurance mechanism? So the question to you and maybe to IMF colleagues, Catherine or Raphael, Mehdi. Mm-hmm.
So I think one trend that we're already seeing in many countries around the world, and we are sure to see in the next few months, is that the role of state-owned enterprise is going to increase tremendously. Existing state-owned enterprises, but also companies that cannot on their own survive, and for one reason or another, the state decides that they are strategic and basically nationalizes them. And this doesn't have to be like an outright nationalization. It can just naturally happen through financing packages, because if the government spends a lot of money supporting a particular company and becomes the majority shareholder in this process, then they are the majority shareholder. So there is nothing sinister about that particular act of helping these companies. But once that happens, as we know from history and from research, both in our own region in Eastern Europe, but really around the world, Latin America, Africa, and so on, state-owned enterprises are not functioning in the way that profit maximization, the way that we understand it in the private sector, operates. So they quickly become conduits or channels, not just for economic state policy, but also just for politics. So we know from research that state-owned enterprises or workers in state-owned enterprises vote, let's say, differently from the general public, much more in favor of incumbents. Why? Well, because they're beholden by them. So a very large share of state-owned enterprise resurgence maybe in the short run helps us as conduits of these instruments that we've been discussing, because they can reach easily, for example, subcontractors, small firms that otherwise we cannot reach through support easily. But we, again, very soon, this is why I was saying about next instruments are in order. We need to think, what are the instruments to support the governance mechanism of these state-owned enterprises? And actually, what is the exit mechanism of governance? Because in the private sector, in private equity, you always worry about exit. So what do you do once the company has been recovered and is operating well? With state-owned enterprises, this is a lot more difficult, but a number of countries, and I'll finish with that, Portugal, the United Kingdom, have these recovery funds where the state temporarily takes, if needed, equity stakes, but there is a very clear mechanism of who runs it, and then when the exit takes place. So I think that's my prediction is one of the next fiscal monitors of the IMF will be covering that theme, because it's a huge theme for all of us. Thank you.
Catherine?
Yeah, so I very much agree with Simeon that we're going to see the increased role of state-owned enterprises because of governments getting involved, equity injections, takeovers, like we've seen in previous crises. They're also going to be more important because they provide very needed public services and water, electricity. State-owned banks, development banks are able to get to firms in medium, small, micro, farmers, et cetera, that often the private sector doesn't get to. They're going to be important probably in the recovery. So people are talking about the need for a green recovery. State-owned enterprises are very important in the power sector. And so to the extent that they can shift their portfolios then from brown to green, this will help in a green recovery. But we need those governance mechanisms then as discussed, right now, their state-owned enterprises are very important, but their productivity tends to be lower than private enterprises. That depends on lots of things, particularly in the institutional setting. We found that state-owned enterprises that in countries that have very high levels of perceived corruption, then that productivity difference is much larger than in countries where the control of corruption is much better. Improving then transparency really is key, as Raphael had discussed. Financial disclosures, the public sector knowing who they have and whether the rationale for those still makes sense, and good corporate governance and control and oversight. Those will be important, have been important, and they'll continue to be important with this increasing role of state-owned enterprises.
Thank you very much. Just to finish perhaps this group of questions, there has been a question from Faith Bozkurk from Turkey, and complementing it from Eleanor Chares from Switzerland, asking about the right size of government. Of course, that's the, I don't know how many $1 trillion question. What is the right size of government post-COVID? Because as you just, both of you, Simeon and Katrin mentioned, there are new rules. Maybe healthcare has to be reformed and with more public participation in some countries, particularly in the Americas. But at the same time, as Eleanor stresses, there are concerns about crowding out in the end. And we heard some safety mechanism already mentioned. Zsoka mentioned the right incentives and the like. You, Simeon, you highlighted already the sunset clause, the exit strategy, so to speak. So you partially answered this question, but maybe let me put it like this. How worried are you today that the private sector, which should be operated on market basis, will be crowded out because of pressure lobbying of certain constituencies for more and more government? And that I would like to ask everybody, in fact, because I think it's a very big question. You can have a very short answer. So maybe I start with Zsoka. Zsoka from EBRD, the bank that really has overseen and supported the transformation from pure state planning, state economy toward the market-based economy. How you see the risks in the EBRD region, in Eastern Northern and the MENA Central Asia region?
So I think I would start maybe with a more general point on the size of the state. I think countries may end up at very different points on the spectrum of how large a state the population demands. I think this is one of those areas where people's preferences, and in particular preferences towards risk and return and the trade-off between them, may end up with very different trade-offs in different countries. I think it would be possible that we might see an even larger role of the state in continental Europe and a shrinking role in, for instance, the US, and that these differences will become exacerbated by the current crisis. Now, on the size of the state in general, we've seen, and secularly increasing trend in many cases. We've also seen that it tends to increase after, cyclically after crises, as we've seen in past crises, as people risk aversion may change as well, and they may demand more of the state to step in. So I think I will leave it at that and hand over to colleagues.
Thank you very much, Simeon.
I think
as a former deputy prime minister and finance minister, where do you see the pressure?
We're going to see a lot more state, both directly through fiscal support, as we already have seen, but I think that will continue this year, that will continue next year, for some countries probably even the year after, because as I said, the recovery has many uncertainties. And this is even excluding the more medically related topic of is there's going to be a second wave. We've seen some countries in our region, North Macedonia, for example, that opened up and then had to close within a week, and now has an explosion of cases. So we know of several countries like that around the world, which creates yet another set of health as well as fiscal problems. But even if we assume that we're going to deal with the pandemic, there's going to be directly more state in how the state finances firms and sectors and jobs. And then some of these firms would need to be somehow kept alive for social reasons or for just as transmitters of social policies. And therefore we'll see much more state-owned enterprise. I think this is inevitable and we should not resist it. We should just try to be as efficient as possible about how the governance of it is run, and also think of exit mechanisms, as you mentioned, Piroska, from the start, which a few countries are already doing in Europe, in other parts of the world. So we have the good examples. Once we get to the exit, we've seen in many regions in the world how difficult that is, because politics then plays a very large role. These enterprises are typically large, so they have lots of workers. These workers often are used for political reasons, not because they want to, but because of the way that state-owned enterprises are run. So this is going to be a difficult two-decade-long process. This is not going to be 2-3 years and then we're back to normal. And I'll again say that we actually don't know what normal is, because some sectors are for sure going to be very different in 2 to 3 years than they are now. Some of this is already written, how tourism is going to be, for example, mass tourism and so on. But there are many other sectors that we don't think of now that are going to go through a quite transformative change. And that may be good, but the transition is going to be painful.
Thank you very much. Any thoughts from IMF colleagues? Catherine, on the size of government, or should I give you another question?
Yeah, no, just on that. Yeah, so I wanted to pick up too on the uncertainty about the structure of the economy and what that's going to mean, because yeah, as Simeon was mentioned, we are anticipating sectoral changes given the structure of demand and developments, but we don't know. And so governments then have to decide how much to continue supporting, existing firms, or to let those go, and there are the costs of that. Not just the cost for the workers, but the cost that those firms have built up relationships with their clients, with governments, all of that capital. And so we've also started to think then about some of the trade-offs there, and those are going to depend, on what would be the costs of misallocation if you don't facilitate that kind of misallocation, but you don't know exactly what the structure is going to be. But then there's a trade-off too, because workers moving to different sectors, there are costs then of those moves. And without active labor market policies or job retraining, then those kinds of costs are also very high. So you really have to balance that, I think, in deciding how much to provide, wage subsidies or continue different types of policies. And as mentioned, then we're going to continue to see this increasing role. Governments have to think smartly who to support, how to do it in strategic sectors, how to do it transparently, and how to manage while they're there, and in some cases how to exit.
Okay, excellent. A question about emerging markets, emerging market economies in general. This is from Jordan Isaac in Singapore. And there are related questions in other regions. So the question of Jordan is, emerging markets obviously have less fiscal room. We have heard it from various presentations, although I recall Zsoka highlighted that administrative capacity actually can be just as a binding, if not bigger binding constraint when it comes to executing a big policy. But there is less fiscal room in general. That's the perception. So what are the single most important things emerging markets should focus on when deciding about the allocation of scarce resources? Who would like to take that? I see Raphael edging.
Yeah, I could maybe give some thoughts on that, and then other speakers are welcome to contribute a little bit more. From the perspective of the emerging markets, certainly one key features that we have seen is that many countries are facing limited fiscal space due to their already high debt level. And at the same time, the social safety nets may not be as strong as those in the advanced economies. So in that context, I mean, certainly one needs to find those measures that have a high impact that could protect people and firms at the same time. From the country fiscal measures that we have been able to keep track, that's why one of the reasons that emerging markets do not seem to provide significant liquidity support, partly because of the limited fiscal space. To provide additional support to protect people, one could think of those policymakers in the emerging markets can make use of the existing mechanisms, let's say on the social transfer. For instance, Brazil has appropriately expanded some of the coverage of their BroServe and media programs, which is the social transfer programs, to extend the coverage to 1 million families. Similar in Indonesia, Egypt, and Russia, we also see that there's an expansion of those social safety nets to a various extent. So making use of the existing mechanism is important. Second is about the targeting. For some countries, given there's an limited fiscal space, it is important to transfer or help those that are most needed, either as households or firms. So choosing a right targeting measures will be important. However, there's also some constraints that one need to be mindful of. For instance, the social safety net may not be very good in terms of targeting among emerging markets. So in those circumstances, in-kind provision of goods, making use of the new digital methods to do the cash transfers, or even local communities or local governments can be able to provide the necessary targeted support. Maybe I will stop here, and then other speakers are welcome to join.
Simeon, did you have a thought, or?
I think we discussed the difference between advanced economies and developing economies, which is where many of the questions are. We discussed the limited fiscal space. Also, I should say not just limited fiscal space now, but the cost of future borrowings, because advanced economies, as our IMF colleague showed, basically are facing close to zero interest rates now. And it seems like in the near future, that would be the case too. So further borrowing is also cheap. That's not the case for developing economies. So that's one difference. Second difference that we have not, however, discussed yet is the size of the informal sector. So most developing economies have fairly large, even middle-income countries like Brazil was just mentioned, have fairly large informal sector. So when you think of mechanisms, and if you think of where to spend your limited resources, some of it is just efficiency, which sectors and which firms can survive, which we already have spoken about. But the other one, which is much more acute in developing countries, is how do you support the population? And then this type of retention schemes, job retention schemes that we've been discussing that I think work quite well in advanced economies, they actually don't work well in developing economies simply because such a large part of the population is in informal businesses. So you don't actually have a mechanism to reach them. You may have a financial mechanism through online banking and so on, but they don't exist on the books of the tax ministry, the finance ministry, or the social ministry and so on. So I think it becomes quite important that a large portion in developing countries of this limited fiscal resources do not just approach the firms and how the firms survive the business sector, but also think of these very poor and the informal firms also where most of the not well-to-do people are. And this is what I was mentioning before. This requires different mechanisms. You cannot just say through tax payments, this is the firm pay all of its workers. You somehow need to go through extended social programs, as Raphael just mentioned, through cash transfers and so on. But let me make my last point here. Most of the cash transfer schemes that the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and so on have actually rural. It's mostly about rural workers. So if you look at where these programs have success, it mostly has to do with rural businesses and rural workers. This crisis has disproportionately hit the poor urban population just because of social distances, lockdowns, and so on. So we need quite a different method. I don't know yet what it is, but quite a different method to reach these vulnerable urban populations.
Thank you very much, Simeon. Maybe I linked another questions in this area up here. Barak Singh Thapa from Nepal is asking particularly about low-income countries, and then I think your answer, Simeon, has covered that. He raises one particular factor, and I know that this is this is a big question in many countries which rely on this particular source of income, remittances. So the outlook for remittances in countries such as Nepal and others, of course, in many parts of the world. Remittances used to be counter-cyclical, but now we have a synchronized global shock. What are the expectations and how you see that particular source of income evolving? IMF colleagues, perhaps Catherine?
Maybe Mehdi wants to take this one.
Okay, Mehdi, absolutely, thank you.
Sure. So clearly, remittances will fall because of, as you mentioned, Piroska, the global nature of the shock, which hits most countries at the same time. I mean, especially in the second quarter of 2020. So remittances will fall, and it will have implications for many countries. We have to wait a little bit and see the actual data. An example is the case of Mexico, where remittances have held up relatively well, and with the jobs report that we have recently seen in the case of the US, there is some good indication, good signs that maybe the negative impact is not as large as we think, but clearly that's an important area. And also in MENA region, that's also a region where they rely on remittances, and remittances are linked to oil prices, and commodity prices have fallen significantly. So that's another source of shock, where linked to commodity prices, basically. So I'll stop here.
And just if I may, Piroska,
yes, absolutely.
It relates to my previous comment. These are precisely the people who are not covered by any social programs, either in their country or in the country that they have been working. And yes, there's some not too negative, I would say, news from Mexico, but we actually do have some data from Central Asia, the Kyrgyz Republic, for example, that relies a lot on remittances in Russia, and partly because of the delayed and it seems prolonged pandemic response in Russia, remittances there seem to have really fallen off a cliff. I mean, about the Kyrgyz Republic. We have in the MENA region countries like Lebanon that depend a lot. Well, Nepal itself also depends a lot on remittances from the Gulf states. And as Mehdi mentioned, it's not just COVID, it's also the falling oil prices that suddenly these countries, these fairly well-off countries in the Gulf have substantially curtailed production, and the business sector is suffering. So this is going to have some, not just a few weeks or months. This is going to be a several-year process, and precisely what I was mentioned. Informal workers, workers that depend on remittances and their families. We need to find new ways, both the fiscal space that is necessary, but new ways to reach them, because these are not typically the ones that we reach with the current cash transfer programs we have.
Thank you very much. Very clear. Inevitably, we are getting to questions which ask about how the IMF can help in the post-COVID situation of government debt, particularly low-income countries. I know that the Fiscal Monitor doesn't look into this, but I wonder whether, since we had several questions about this, IMF colleagues could, maybe Catherine could address this briefly. Particularly, Karin Pastenku from Indonesia asked the question. Low-income countries post-COVID debt clearly will be higher. IFI support is significant, and as a result, there will be an increase just on that account in total debt. And Christina Frey, in a very eloquent question, goes around this a little bit too, and she basically raises whether when the IMF helps and supports, whether that would be a chance also to have some conditionality on governance, be it for the government, be it for fiscal enterprises, when you design, when you look at support packages.
Thanks for that important question. Yeah, so low-income countries, emerging market economies, but particularly low-income countries are going to face big pressures on increases in debt. Even before the crisis, there were a range of low-income countries then that were either in debt distress or very high risks of debt distress. They were trying to balance, development and debt, and now the shock. So the IMF itself, has been in the forefront then with using our catastrophe CCRT then to provide debt relief then to some of the poorest members, and the IMF managing director, together with the World Bank president, then called for the G20 action, and we were very, very pleased then at the G20 initiative, which is also then providing debt service relief to low-income countries, to really give them breathing room then in the face of this crisis, to make sure that they have resources to spend for health and the lifelines for populations. The fund has also then called for consideration of private creditors to look at offering similar terms that have been discussed in the G20. And then the second point on linking on the importance of governance then as debt initiatives free up resources, it's really critical. And right now, the emergency financing that the fund does, in addition to the debt relief, there are an unprecedented number of countries who are coming for emergency financing, which is not linked to specific conditions, because the point of it is emergency. But in those financing arrangements, also we're going to pay attention to making sure that, you know, money is well spent, and, you know, ex post mechanisms to ensure that there's transparency and auditing, that governments are establishing, you know, good categorizing of the uses of support, and colleagues in our group who work on public financial management have been producing lots of good guidance then that country teams can use for the good management of these resources. And so I point readers also to these COVID notes that we've been doing in the fund that really talk again about how you set up the mechanisms to make sure that the money is well spent.
May I add
Thank
one
you.
more
Yes,
issue to that?
Briefly.
From a longer term perspective, and what is important is to finance development in a fiscally responsible way, and this is something that we discuss in the Fiscal Monitor. Two aspects matter a lot. One is a lot of low-income developing countries have low tax ratios, so mobilizing domestic revenues matter a lot, and involving private sector matters a lot. And the second one, very briefly, is improving debt management and transparency. So these are the other two areas that we discuss in the Fiscal Monitor are important once the pandemic abates. Thank you.
Excellent. Another group of questions that we've touched upon, but not pulled it together perhaps enough, because there are quite a few questions about the type of policies that you would need to ensure a tilt to the green, that the recovery policies have a green dimension that also supports this fundamental public good of delivering better climate change policy. Stephen Gosling is asking whether an excise duty on jet fuel, for example, could be a good tax measure in your view in that regard. Others also asking about how to ensure that a low carbon economy, Andrew Sherlow particularly, low carbon economy can emerge from this big shock. I know that several factors you have mentioned, but it probably for our fellow colleagues in the audience, it would be good to summarize it. Who would like to go? Raphael, maybe, or Mehdi? Catherine?
Yeah.
Sure.
We have an IMF.
Yeah, if you don't mind, yeah, I'd love to jump in on this because it's so important, really. Right now, you know, there's a lot of government support that we've discussed. There's going to be more with stimulus to help with the recovery, and it's so critical that this is part of the solution and not you know, part of the problem. There's a big opportunity, and we can't say that, you know, climate should be back burner now because of the crisis, because the kinds of decisions that governments are doing right now are going to have very long-term implications if they are geared more toward still the old model. So a couple things, of course, using that public support wisely, governments that are extending support then to carbon intensive industries could mandate that the industries that they support you know, reduce emissions. And we see some examples of this in you know, France, the assistance to Air France, then associated with commitments then from Air France, some measures in Canada. So that's one area. And the type of, the role of green investment, then the public sector also, again, when we get to the stage where public investment will play a role, doing the things that the public sector can do to spend on the grid, et cetera, encourage then low carbon investments in renewables. And then we talked before about the role of state-owned enterprises. This could be, job rich at a time where we're going to really need employment. And you mentioned, the carbon taxes. With low oil prices at this time, maybe this is a good time to again reduce fuel subsidies. Carbon taxes not now, but we're going to need those sources of revenue, and so looking at those then as part of the package going forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to add to that, I mean, we have already
very briefly. Sorry, Raphael, we are running a little close to.
I mean, to add to Kathy's point, I think if we look at some of the fiscal packages that the countries already wrote in response to the pandemic, we also started to see, for instance, European Union, Germany have already started to think about fiscal support in greening the recovery. They are talking about recovery support on green investment, on health systems. Those, I think, is consistent with the thinking that they should, the fiscal support should think about the green recovery aspect. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. We are nearing to the very end of our time. Unfortunately, there are plenty of other questions, and I commit and promise to our active audience that we will come back to your questions. Some relate to data sharing, the exact sources, which is important, but I think we can take it offline if you leave your email address, your availability to us. So I will wrap up with maybe one round question, and literally you would have 10 seconds to answer. A year from now, will we be in a strong recovery case with hopefully the right policies? Of course, you will tell me it's all policy dependent, but what is your baseline scenario? Given what is available there, what are the good policies, the safeguards, what are the risks, the tremendous uncertainty, of course, Simeon will remind me again, but will we be in a reasonably solid recovery in a year's time? And Simeon, let me start with you.
Recovery, yes. With some sectors booming ahead and some sectors falling behind, and us asking them the question, how should we be restructuring these sectors?
Excellent. Zsoka?
I think there is tremendous uncertainty, not just, of course, about the health implications of the virus, but also about responses to it. There's a reason the IMF coded it as the Great Lockdown. So I think the fact that we're seeing many countries move out of lockdowns is encouraging for recoveries, because we would be expecting a rebound more quickly as these countries return to capacity. But of course, it remains very uncertain, with some sectors likely to face permanent damage from the crisis.
And Katrin, maybe in the name of the whole team,
yeah,
and in the time of interest.
Huge uncertainty, but recovery, and we've got to get policies right to maximize then the potential for that recovery.
Great. With that round, thank you. In the name of all our audiences here on Zoom and Facebook, thank you all very much. It was a fascinating discussion. A lot of questions answered, many remains, of course, and news will catch up. I would like to remind our loyal audience that we will have further webinars very soon. On this Thursday, we will have a special one on digital currencies as crisis management tools. Very interesting. Then we will have one on the crucial role of the state in crisis response. And of course, with our very own Simeon Djankov on June 19th, there will be something that we couldn't really go into this year, finance of post-COVID recovery. So with that, again, thank you very much, and good evening, good night everywhere, wherever you are, and we hope to see you at our next seminar. Thank you.
Thank you.